Hi, everyone. This is Brian with the League. Just wanted to just check. Looks like Rob is on the call. Rob, are you there ready?
I am on the call and I'm ready, but for some reason, the screen you see is a live camera. So you're not going to be able to see me in my pretty pink shirt today.
Can you share screen though? That's because I know you have a...
Yes, I can do that.
Okay. So we'll get started. We also have Steve Coleman on the line. He's going to, I think, provide an update later. But just as a reminder, we're starting up the finance director's calls again, and we're going to do them bi-weekly. The main goal for these calls is to have Rob Zarnetsky with the Pandemic Recovery Office go through some updates and answer questions that have come up from cities and towns. So in case you've not heard, Rob is working primarily with cities and towns in the Pandemic Recovery Office, answering questions and serving as a point of contact. So I'll let Rob provide a bit of an update as to what his role is, but just want to make sure everyone knows why we're doing these calls. And also we have Steve Coleman with the Division of Municipal Finance, who will be providing updates as well. We're going to record these just in case there are other finance directors who can't make the call, and we'll have them available on our website later or on the YouTube page that we have. And just, I know some members, some finance directors are on the CEO calls, which we do every other Thursday. We did a call with CEOs last Thursday with Rob. The content of this presentation is essentially the same as the content that the CEOs had last week. We just want to make sure that everybody has the same information and so that there's no confusion. So with that, I will turn it over to Rob.
Great. And you can see my screen, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, good. Well, thank you for spending some time with me today. I don't know how many folks have heard me speak on this topic recently, but basically the Pandemic Recovery Office has assigned me as sort of a liaison to state and local governments. And my role here is more a role of a consultant than anything else. The American Rescue Plan Act specifically requires that the state of Rhode Island and every other state in the country provide distribution without direction. We're not authorized under the act, the state is not authorized under the act to give additional direction to municipal governments. Municipal governments are responsible for the allocation and the administration of ARPA funds in total. You're responsible, you're completely on the hook. We cannot give you guidance, we can't fill in the gaps, to be honest with you. We can't even tell you what we think the Treasury meant when it said something in its regulations to a legal effect. That having been said, we want to make sure that we are providing, an extra set of eyes, and we are listening, and we are in a position to give you an impression. It just can't be the controlling impression. Ultimately, what the regulations mean, ultimately what the purpose of the act is something that every municipality in the country has got to determine for itself. I've been describing this recently as the new federalism, or the newest new federalism. This is really the federal government reaching out to local governments very directly in really the broadest sense, certainly in modern American history. Having local governments on the hook in this way, where there is no application that is reviewed by the state, where there is no application that is reviewed by the federal government before implementation, is a completely new model of how to do public administration. They're sending the money, they're sending their instructions, and it's up to you to make sure that the expenditure of the monies happens in accord with those instructions. And now, again, this gets us back to our consultancy role here at the PRO. We are here to help. We are happy to talk through the issues. We're happy to give you perspective. I am talking to municipalities across the state and reading on the programs that folks are doing across the country every single day. This is all we're doing in the PRO. So we do have expertise in the office, and we have access to expertise across the country. Treasury is pretty good about getting back to us when we pose questions to them. We are happy to put all of those resources at your disposal. Now, when I spoke to the CEOs, municipal CEOs a few weeks ago, I said, we've got about 2 hours a month that can be dedicated to everybody, every municipality in the state. If everybody were to call us here and look for about 2 hours worth of consulting every month, that would take up the time, the man hours that we have available. Right now, we're burning less than that rate. So, I'm happy to take more questions and more inquiries at this point, but that's sort of the benchmark. You can sort of think about asking us to do research, asking us to puzzle through a problem for about 2.5 hours each month. Some of the questions we're getting are overlaps, obviously. So, we have some wiggle room there. I just want to set a benchmark, and that benchmark is each of you owns my time for a couple of hours a month. Moving on to the first item on the agenda that was sent out. We have received the county share funds. The state received those monies last week. Under the Treasury guidance, we have 60 days to turn those funds around to the municipalities. One thing that we're looking at right now, and we're trying to figure out, is how those monies should be allocated, given the fact that the that the Census Bureau will be coming out with the new municipal level body counts, the population counts on Thursday. Treasury, when it made the initial distributions back in June, July, they did that based on 2019 numbers. But they did that because those were the only numbers available that were consistent across county and local government levels of government. The census is now, as of Thursday, going to have 2020 numbers for both the county and for the municipalities. So it may end up being preferable from a consistency point of view, from just straight logical point of view, to be using the 2020 census numbers when those become available on Thursday. That having been said, there's also a lot to be said for just going with the numbers that the Treasury has already put out. We've got a request in for some guidance on this. I'm not sure what we're going to hear back from Treasury in terms of guidance. So on Thursday, we will make a decision here. If there are material differences, if there's a big difference between the 2019 numbers and the 2020 numbers, we've got a challenge. We suspect that the numbers aren't going to be radically different, so we'll probably be fine making distributions based on the 19 numbers. And then the only question is, do we want to be consistent and use 2020 for counties and for the cities, since we've got them. The legislation actually does require that you use the latest census data, and that also is a ripple in all of this. I do want to talk a little bit about reporting and public participation. There's been a lot of discussion about public participation among municipalities here in Rhode Island. For the non-entitlement units of government, for the small towns, for the towns that are not the 6 big metro cities here in Rhode Island, the guidance is that there is no particular way, no method, no one size fits all approach to public participation. But the Treasury Department has made clear through its guidance in so many ways. I mean, it just keeps popping up. They really want to encourage everybody to do some sort of size appropriate, organization appropriate, town appropriate public participation. They do not want to see programs that are administered by anybody, any recipient, that haven't taken into account public opinion, public perception of what is needed. they really are looking for towns to do something to capture public opinion on how these funds should be spent to address the most urgent needs in the community. Now, that having been said, since there is no one size fits all for the smaller communities, and I'm going to pause here for a second and say, with regard to the larger communities, and this is instructive, it's not determinative, but it's instructive. There is a very detailed requirement for a public participation plan for the larger cities. So Warwick and Providence and Cranston, they all have a very detailed and specific plan that has to be put together. The smaller towns are not required to do that. But again, finding something that is appropriate is strongly encouraged by the Treasury guidance. So what is appropriate really is up to each and every one of the municipalities to determine. I've thought some about this, and I'm going to share this perspective. If we look at public administration and public participation in the United States for the last century, the last half century, good public participation, what constitutes reasonable practice, boils down to two things, I think. It boils down to fair notice. The public has notice about what the government intends to do. So 2 weeks before there's going to be a hearing, or 2 weeks before a decision is going to be made by the town council, or 2 weeks, some period of time, some reasonable period of time, the public has notice about what the intended expenditure is, what the intended use of the funds are. And then the second piece is a meaningful opportunity to comment before the decision is made. Some sort of way to get public citizen input by the decision maker, whether it's a council or a committee or a commission that's been set up for this purpose. It's some sort of opportunity for the public to comment. It doesn't require that there be a big, heavy, lift survey or referendum on every expenditure, but there is, I think, a minimum level of public participation that constitutes the standard, the minimal standard, if you look across what we've been doing for the last half century anyway. On reporting, the small towns, NEUs, you probably are familiar with this requirement at this point, do not have to put in the sort of large detailed plans that the cities have got to put in on August 31st. Your first report is due on October 31st. A template has been put out by the Treasury Department, and we'll make sure that the league's got that, and you'll have that well before October, so that you can work from that form. One thing that we're starting to focus on here, I'm trying to get a handle on, I've been looking for some models, and in fact, if anybody has got a model that they really like, I'd love to hear from you about what you're doing to sort of do a checklist or an evaluation, a pre-award evaluation for sub-recipients. As you know, under the Act and under the regulations, municipalities can make grants, sub-grants, to nonprofit organizations, and there really needs to be an assessment of the capacity of those organizations to do what they propose to do effectively. Municipalities are wholly liable for the actions of subrecipients. It's as if you were delivering the product or delivering the service yourself. You have to make sure that that whoever you're giving money to can actually deliver. And there is a difference between a subrecipient and a contractor, and that may be something for finance directors, procurement officers, and municipalities to think about. You do shift the responsibility when you're putting it into a contract as opposed to a sub recipient or sub grant relationship. It may make sense if you've got a nonprofit organization that regularly engages in contracts for a particular type of service, a warming shelter or a particular education program. If they're entering into contracts on a regular basis, it may be desirable to enter into a contract rather than a sub-recipient's relationship. You still have to do due diligence, you still have to comply with the procurement rules, but you're not in the same place, you're not in the same shoes as you would be if you made a sub-award of these monies. So that's an important distinction. And again, we're looking for some risk assessment tools because we know that some of the smaller municipalities don't really make grants, and this is going to be an unusual function or activity for some folks out there. And we'd like to have a nice, simple form. I am currently looking at one that the state of Rhode Island's put together the state of Vermont has put together that seems nice. The Rhode Island forms that we use at the state level are wonderful. They're great. They're wonderful assessment tools, but they are also pretty detailed and somewhat difficult to work through. So I'm looking for a simple but comprehensive form. One of the big questions that has come up, and I'd like to end with this, my slide deck with this, and move to questions and some thoughts about this. The treatment of revenue loss over time. I know that a lot of the municipalities out there are looking to take advantage of this provision in the act, which says that if you lost revenue, then you can claim that revenue as a particular pot of funds that has a great deal of discretion, greater discretion than any of the other pots of funding under ARPA. It's appealing because it seems to have more flexibility than the specified categories in ARPA. That having been said, I think that it's also going to be important to make sure that we don't take flexibility as an excuse not to document. So long as we're documenting everything and everything is well justified, I think you're fine. There is a great deal of flexibility. I have heard some comments from folks, not just here in Rhode Island, but elsewhere, suggesting that, you know, this is a get out of jail free card. And so long as we can say it's revenue replacement, we're just dealing with the lost revenue from prior years, we can do whatever we'd like with the money. That clearly is not the case. There are clearly uses of the funds that are prohibited. And there is still the need to ensure that you're doing things that are consistent with the act. So this is a much more flexible category than the others, but it still does require us to do some analysis around one, what we're doing with it to make sure that we're not engaging in an unallowed use. And those unallowed uses are, we can't put the money into the pensions, we can't put the money into a rainy day fund, and we can't put the money into debt service. The rainy day fund piece is an interesting problem because what we have here in Rhode Island and in most municipalities elsewhere, as far as I know, is designated versus undesignated funds. And if we've got the revenue replacement funds that are sitting, let's say, for 6 months or a year, and they haven't been identified or associated with a purpose, a particular function, then they are essentially undesignated, right? They haven't been designated to a particular purpose. Is that a rainy day fund contribution, which is prohibited, is the question. Now, the answer to that may very well be, so long as you've identified the purpose to which those funds are going to be put, they're not undesignated. They are in fact designated for that particular use. And then the question becomes, how specific do you have to be? Do you have to actually have the project with a more or less specific number associated with it? Or can you sort of do this as a big catch-all? This portion of money, let's call it $1 million, is set aside for ARPA projects to be identified. Is that a sufficient designation to take that out of the undesignated fund, rainy day fund category, or do you need to be more specific is the question. We don't know the answer, to be honest with you. The guidance from Treasury is somewhat ambiguous here. There's a lot of language that suggests that you have to be much more specific than simply saying unidentified to be identified projects in the future. But there's some language, particularly around the specific infrastructure projects authorized for sewer, water, and broadband that suggests that designation doesn't have to be as specific. So it's an open question. It's one of the things that I think that if I were a municipal finance director, I'd be thinking a lot about and I'd be concerned about. So I want to just raise that. I will point out that one thing that is fairly clear about this category of spending is that the same time frame applies as all other spending. You still have to have incurred the costs for the monies in this pot by December 31st, 2024. And incurred means contractually obligated to spend. So you do have these funds that can sort of be there to be expended over that whole period of time, which again raises a question, how specific do we have to be in the identification of the purpose, because they're going to sit there in that case for 2 years, right? So it's an interesting little puzzle that Treasury has put before you. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing the screen and stop talking for a minute.
Thanks, Rob. Let's open it up to questions. And so just indicate using the Zoom feature, raise your hand, or if you're on camera, just indicate if you have a question. Jim.
So on the revenue replacement, if I do nothing with it, am I okay? Because then it will just hit my fund balance? Or do I still then have to designate it for a project? And does the time frame of the 2 years of 2024 or whatever the date is still apply if I pick up those funds as revenue replacement?
Yeah, so you're asking, exactly the right questions on that. And I think the answer has to be formed with an understanding of the purpose of the act, trying to live by the spirit and the rule of the act, right? I mean, we can't treat this category, I think it would be unwise to treat this category as a loophole. If you're trying to be clever about the design here so as to avoid the spirit or the rule of the law, I think you're asking for trouble. I think the way to do this that is best is to look specifically at the rules we know. We know that we've got until December 31st, 2024 to expend the funds from all categories. That we know. So that period of time is available even for your revenue replacement funds. That's pretty clear. What we don't know is whether contributing to the undesignated fund balance would be considered rainy day contribution. And reason suggests sort of rational people are probably going to more or less agree that if it's not designated, then it's undesignated. And if it's undesignated, it's rainy day fund. So the level of specificity is the question. Do you have to actually say, I'm going to do X number of miles of road at X price or Y price? That's a very specific designation. That probably is pretty good right through 2024, through December 31st, 2024.
So one of our plans is we can eat up most of our money using the formulas that they've given us for the revenue replacement.
Yep.
We pretty much account for everything. Moving forward, I plan to use that to fund my OPEB, which is allowable because it's not pension. And they've been specific on that. But I'm just going to pull it out of those funds each year as my budgetary line item, which I can go through 2025, fiscal year 2025. So while I've got a lot of money, I don't want to do it all at once. That's okay, I'm guessing. If I meet the needs, I meet the time frame, and I've basically taken it out of a budget item and just use, because we're going to designate these funds into a special fund so we can track it and account for it. I should be safe. And
So-
I don't I'm not looking to undermine the spirit. I'm
Right.
looking to undermine my reporting requirements. Because
Yeah.
that, once I get into the projects, that becomes a mess. I want to keep my reporting requirements as simple as possible.
So you've designated, it's not undesignated. There's a
Right.
purpose to which it has already been put.
Yep.
It's just a question of timing on the payments. You've got a time frame that allows for payments. That doesn't sound far afield at all, right? I mean, that sounds like you've hit each of the check boxes and you're good to go. You're
Yep.
not just putting the money into, an undifferentiated fund. You're separating it out, you're designating it for a particular purpose, and you're sticking to the timeline.
Okay, so I should be okay. Good, thank you.
So again, I can't tell you what Treasury is going to do with it. All I can tell you is what I think about it, and those benchmarks are important ones.
Yeah, because I can undesignate the funds for something else. So our thought is, if a project comes up that meets the requirements that we need it, that's why I don't want to put it all in OPEB at front, and then I can spend it in a later year.
Great.
Yeah.
Peter? And then Chris?
I'm trying to, there we go. I mean, just my thinking on this to cover both bases is to do the public participation as part of the formal budget process, which we did in May, and which we can do the following year, in which case we'll show as part of our financial plan going forward that what we're estimating based upon revenue loss or pledged revenues for qualified expenses under the Act, and that our financial statements and our presentation to the public and to the council reflects what we want to do. And that takes care of both the public participation and how we're planning to spend the money. So that's our theory right now.
So the only thing I'd suggest I'd be thinking about, Peter, is you guys are in a different category for public participation. Your public
Yeah.
participation is pretty heavy
Yeah,
on sort of outreach to individual communities and disproportionately impacted neighborhoods and people. So I think that for you, it's a little bit more complicated than it would be for some of the other towns.
all right, let me review the FAQ again. I'm more or less comfortable going that route.
One
But
thing
I-
that I will do is, so we've had, Peter, we've had heard from some of the other metro communities,
Yeah,
Woonsocket and East Providence. They have
Yeah.
used survey tools. So what I'll do is I will, when we get the slide deck, I will send that around
right.
with a few of the things that have come up in the CEO calls. And another thing that's helpful about these calls, in addition to the CEO calls, it's an opportunity to share best practices. So if someone has a good idea, rather than have to come up with it on your own, you can just,
Yeah.
take someone else's technique. In fact, Mayor De Silva said that in East Providence, he took Mayor Baldelli Hunt's survey from Woonsocket, said, this is working great. I'm going to use this for East Providence. So
Okay.
it's a good opportunity to share best practices. I'll send that information around later. Chris?
Good morning. Can you just clarify for me? I was on the CEO's call the other day and I thought I heard something that we couldn't use the revenue loss for the county funds. I just want to clarify
Oh,
that.
yes, good. I'm glad you brought that up. We don't know yet. The problem we've got with the county distribution is that in order to calculate your revenue loss, you'd have to have revenue as a baseline. And we don't currently have a baseline for county revenue for anybody because counties don't collect revenue in Rhode Island. So we've asked the Treasury Department for a determination. What we'd like to be able to do is use the per capita revenue number for counties across the country, which is how we come, by the way, to the 4.1% in the revenue loss. That's the average growth for a revenue stream for all governments, all local governments across the country. So we've asked Treasury to say, yes, you can use a per capita, but right now we're stymied in trying to use the county share as revenue loss because we don't have a baseline for that revenue. There is no revenue, no county revenue. I'm sorry, was I clear enough there, Chris? I'm sorry.
No, yeah, you were, and I had a follow-up and I just lost it. Okay, so, oh yeah, so if we, right now, if we don't use the county money, we just stick to the other areas for the ARPA money. Can we use 100% of the NEU direct funds, if you want to call it that, as lost revenue, or do we, I know there was something about 75%, so I just need clarification on that.
Yeah, so there's a couple of different things there. The 75% cap is that the distribution made by the state to a municipality cannot exceed 75% of its budget. So that's the first thing. And then the revenue loss is a formula specified in the regulation. And it is basically the difference between what you would have made, what you would have taken in as revenue if you were on the same trajectory that you would have been on before COVID. And really, for most of us, that's going to end up being 4.1% because Rhode Island doesn't have revenue growth that exceeds the national average, generally speaking. So they've put in place either your trajectory and the difference between where you would be and where you are because of COVID, or 4.1% and where you are. And the reason they did the 4.1% is the trajectory for all local governments across the nation is that. We see 4.1% growth in revenue for all, the average for all local government is 4.1%. So you can choose either your actual trajectory, your actual loss, or the 4.1%, which is the growth and the difference between that and what you actually have.
Right, and that could take up all my NEU allocation, and that would be fine.
I suppose it could. I haven't seen anybody's math that gets you to 100% of it, but there's no reason. The rules don't say it can't.
Okay.
Rob, just while we're on the county question, could you just go over when the state determines which census estimates you're using 2019 and 2020? When you do those distributions, what is going to be required of the cities and towns to access those funds? I know that there's going to be some certification process, and it's going to be a little different for the metro community. So I want to make sure that they're familiar with what will be coming.
Yeah, so it's going to be the same process that you went through for the first distribution of the NEU monies. We're not going to require that you update your budget, but we will require that you certify that your budget as submitted back in June hasn't changed. If you've amended your 2019 budget since June, since it was submitted, you're going to have to tell us that, and you're going to have to give us an updated copy. Some folks may have gone back in theory. I doubt it actually happened, but could have gone back in theory and amended the prior budget. If that has happened, we need to know that, so as to be able to calculate the 75%.
And for the metro communities?
They don't need to give us a budget. They don't need to give us certification that they have, changed the budget or anything like that, because we're not worried about the 75% on their monies. This is just a pass through to them.
But they will have to fill something out.
They have a form that they'll have to give us and they will certify that they're going to, comply with federal law on anti-discrimination and things like that. But there's no state requirements that have found their way into a form or anything like that.
Okay, thank you. I just want to make sure the metro communities were aware that there's an actual step that they'd have to take to access the funds, because previously those came directly from Treasury.
Yeah, these
So-
county monies will not be coming directly from Treasury to anybody. They all have to come through the state, because it's county money that has to be divided among the municipalities in the counties.
Great, thanks for clarifying. John?
Yeah, just calling, questioning about, I haven't heard it yet, but the gambling commissions coming to us because of Twin River, just wondering if that question has ever been answered. I haven't heard it yet about whether or not that qualifies as revenue loss for recovery.
Tiverton asked the same question on
Yes.
Thursday, so.
Oh.
We're still tracking that down. Rob, I don't know if you have any updates. I did send that question to the governor's office. I know the state is still trying to figure that out right now. I don't
We
know,
are
Rob, if you
still,
have any updates.
I don't. You know, it is a particular form of revenue that was specifically talked about in the Treasury regulation, but not in relationship to municipalities. So it's a complicated question. I don't know the answer yet.
But John, I do have that question pending with the governor's office. We collected those and I have that sent in. So hopefully we'll have more information soon.
Okay, that's all right. We won't be making any decisions before an election in September, so we'll be waiting patiently. Thank you.
Great. Other questions for Rob? Any general questions for the group? I know, as I mentioned, it's a good opportunity to, if you're struggling, thinking about how you're going to be spending money or how you're developing your plans, this is a good opportunity to share best practices or questions. So if people want to open the floor for a few minutes, if people have questions for each other. Adam?
Hey, everybody, I'll throw this out there. Just curious how the smaller communities, the NEUs, I think that's how we're terming it, how they're engaging the community. I understand that that's not a hard and fast rule or requirement like the larger communities have, but it's still kind of a best practice that the Treasury wants to see there. Curious how that's being done. I know that there were some surveys, the larger communities seem to be going that route. Curious what smaller communities are doing. Thank you.
Good. Chris?
Sure, I'll respond. So far, I think we're going to steal that nice survey from the mayor there. I forget where she's from. We're going to steal that, and I believe we'll probably have in like a work session or a public comment on whatever we're going to plan on doing with these funds once we get a final rule on them. I'm not rushing to get them out there yet, trying to push that off. But that's my plan, and part of it will probably be the budget process at that point.
So that special meeting, is that something separate from your budget process, or is
Yeah.
it, would that meeting be, okay, separate? All right. Thank
Like
you.
a work session, public work session or a public hearing, whatever, not finalized yet.
Kathy, Kathy Raposa, I don't mean to put you on the spot. If you're active, I know that Barrington was working on, there was a working group that Jim Cunha spoke about. I don't know if you can provide any update on that.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, we recently had a meeting last week, and it was more just like an update that we're still waiting, for final rulings and everything like that. Jim had put together a list, and we kind of went through and prioritized what we thought was important.
And did you have a group of different, it sounded like there was a group of stakeholders, like a working group from some council members and others that were on that?
That
I
is
remember.
correct. Yep.
And what was that group made up of? Do you know what the membership was?
It was, I believe, 2 council members, 2 committee on appropriation people, 2 outside people. It was a diverse group. I think there was about, I want to say like 8 to 10 people in it.
Great, thank you. And I think that's one of the approaches, so you can do the budget process, but then some communities like Barrington have actually created working groups to solicit some of these ideas and vet them, and also make sure that they comply with the ARPA requirements. I think that's one thing that we've heard, is that it's easy to collect information from the public, but then the due diligence is on the municipality to make sure that it is compliant with ARPA. So you can get all the great ideas in the world, you just need to make sure that they comply. Great, other questions for the group? Great, Rob?
Just quickly, Steve Coleman reminds me, I didn't mention it. Forms will be going out tomorrow, request forms for distribution of the county funds. Deadline for submission back to the state will be the 24th of August.
Great, thank you. One more item, in case you've not seen it, Rob is doing another training session tomorrow. So one question that has come up frequently is, how do I determine if a project is eligible? And as Rob has made it clear, the state can't really say what they can and can't do, what municipalities can and can't do. But there is a kind of a framework that you can think through when you're determining whether or not a project is eligible. So Rob is going to be doing a training on that tomorrow. So we're inviting CFOs, CEOs, planners, and anyone else who's participating in the ARPA project process. I will send that link around later, registration link. It's tomorrow, 10 a.m. On Zoom. And I will send that around. I see Diane Baker has a question.
Thanks. That was one of the things. I'm unfortunately can't attend tomorrow, but I'm still trying to figure out if we're still all working with those 4 criteria, which are pretty restrictive when it comes to these use of funds for the NEUs. Is that still the case? Because, you know, the COVID, you know, the 4 major criterias, COVID expenses, I think pay for employees, some community sort of support, and then infrastructure, which is very narrow in the type of infrastructure. Is that still the group that we're working within for our funding?
So yes, I will say that there's been something of an evolution in the way that Treasury describes those criteria over the last couple of months. They are restrictive, and you know, they initially were very, very restrictive with regard to infrastructure projects, for example. Those criteria still apply, but we have seen sort of the communities looking to find ways to do broader things. The revenue replacement category is one where we've seen a lot of growth in sort of the creativity about service delivery or program delivery. And Treasury has shifted and you know, talked about those things in a more open way. I think you're right. You need to be careful about not breaking the mold, but there is some flexibility in those 4 categories, and there's ways to achieve a lot of the objectives that folks have described that really are about how you describe the projects, how you justify the projects, how you talk about the projects, how you deliver the projects. You know, if you can identify, for example, a disproportionately impacted community and actually track that you are serving that disproportionately impacted community, there's a lot of leeway around what you do to benefit that group. If you can justify and explain why a particular local industry was disproportionately affected by COVID. So in Rhode Island, for example, not everywhere, but in Rhode Island, the fishing industry clearly was dramatically impacted by COVID. It's not one of the listed categories. It's not travel, it's not tourism, it's not hospitality. But if we can explain why that industry was particularly impacted, there's a lot of opportunity and leeway to provide economic relief, or to design a program that would provide economic relief to that industry. Likewise with any industry, you may have a very, you know, it may be, I don't know, you know, pole beans or something, but you know, whoever the local industry is, if there's a way to explain what COVID did to that industry and what you're doing to help them, there's a lot of room for actually designing programs that work.
Okay, thank you.
And I think, Jen, are we going to record the session tomorrow? So Diane, if you want to, we'll make that link available on the YouTube page once it's done, so anyone can refer to that after the fact.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Great. I know we have Steve Coleman who wanted to provide an update briefly, so I'll just ask any last questions for Rob. Okay, Steve? Are you there?
Hold on one second. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
All right, there we go. So I just wanted to let everybody know on the phone call, Friday, Municipal Finance sent a letter to the Senate President and the Speaker of the House, notifying them that we had a revised tax equalization, or AEWAV, that we submitted. And just so everybody's aware, in case you're not, our division finalizes the tax equalization study each year by August 1st. Last year's study, 2018, is used in the calculation for a few different aid programs, the major one being education aid. So each year, the division tries to evaluate how we do the process. And this past year, one of the improvements we made is that we submitted back one of the documents that we received from your assessors back to them for this current period study. And as a result of doing that, a few of the municipalities or assessors noticed that the information supplied in the last period was incorrect. So those municipalities are North Kingston, West Warwick, Foster, and Cumberland. The impact of which won't be reflected, or I should say that RIDE will do a calculation to see what the impact of that is. So this week, we should be able to provide an impact from that information. I do have to say that basically West Warwick and Foster were very minimal. There was almost no change in education aid. The larger impact was Cumberland, and a smaller, relatively speaking, impact for North Kingston. If anybody wanted to discuss the information, we could definitely do that. Just give us a call. And the other aspect is that we feel at Municipal Finance that the information that's being supplied as a part of the study, we need to work with the municipalities and assessors a little bit more closely in getting the information. So what we're going to be doing this year is we're going to try to collect the information for the study earlier. It's actually 2 years behind, so there's really no reason we can't collect it, well in advance. So we're going to try that this year. The deadline for submission of the documentation on a yearly basis is August 15th, along with certification documents for your tax assessments. But we'll be reaching out to every assessor in the state to set up individual meetings so we can run through the documentation between now and November. Also at the assessor meeting, which is happening on the 20th, Chris Celeste in my office will be doing a presentation and briefly discuss the overarching documentation and provide the the opportunity to have those one-on-one meetings to go through that information. So again, there'll be an impact on education aid. Other aid programs utilize the study, and we did evaluation. There's nothing really major impact for those other programs. And then RIDE will be providing that information hopefully this week. And the last part of it is how the legislature will actually choose to reflect the change. That we're not sure. So we submitted the documentation RIDE. RIDE will produce the impact, and then it'll be up to the legislature to decide, whether or not to adopt those changes or do some other variation on that. But as soon as we get more information, we'll be sure to share it.
Great. Any questions for Steve? Okay, if anyone has any remaining questions, feel free to email them to me and or Rob. I will include in the email follow-up, I'll have Rob's contact information so you can reach out to him. And as he mentioned, you can view him sort of as a consultant, but one thing that's helpful is that if as he mentioned, if somebody has a question, chances are someone else has the question. So we're going to try to compile information and get it out, use these calls and use follow-up emails so that people are sharing best practices and information. So if you have a great idea, or if you have something that's working well in your community, how you're handling your ARPA funds, please make sure that you share that with others as well. We want to have some of those best practices around. Any other questions for the group?
Brian, I'll just note that I put the link to our YouTube channel in the chat for anyone who wants to take a look at it.
Excellent, thanks. And yes, for those who don't know, Jen has been compiling a lot of these recorded calls and putting them on the YouTube channel. So it's a great resource. If you want to take a look at, if you missed something in the past, feel free to take a look at that. Excellent. So our next call will be in 2 weeks, going back to the standard 10 a.m. time. And if you have any other questions in the meantime, feel free to reach out to me or Rob. Thank you all very much. Have a good day.
Thank you.